America is the center of the world, and they were all weird know-it-alls about pretty much every subject. Number 3, they are overly obsessed with identity and labeling things.
Visit a new country, but the truth is every single time I go, I always have to have at least one uncomfortable conversation about how stupid and rude Americans are, and the reason it comes across that way is because Americans are just golden retrievers.
Picture this, you come home from a trip, and the punishment isn't for what you did, it's for what you felt. That's what happened to a wave of European travelers this year, not because they broke a rule, but because they broke a script. The script said, go to America, come back with proof of decline. Instead, they came back with something far more dangerous. Admiration. They landed guarded, rehearsing the warnings they'd grown up on. Then a waiter kept refilling a glass no one asked twice for, and a stranger struck up a conversation expecting nothing back. And the fear they'd packed for the trip simply had nowhere left to sit. By the time they were boarding the flight home, some of them were crying, not from exhaustion, but because leaving felt like losing something they'd only just found. So they said it anyway, on camera, without apology. And that's when the real story began. Back home, the reply wasn't curiosity, it was silence. The kind that tells you praise is only welcome in one direction. Visit if you must, just don't come back convinced. And yet, one by one, they kept talking anyway, which leaves one question worth sitting with. Why does loving a place cost more than hating it ever did?
And then they landed, and the first crack showed up within about 48 hours.
Okay, listen, I have a really unpopular opinion about the United States as European, and this is why. I think it is super safe. People think that they're having everywhere, they're having robberies everywhere, but in fact, that's not the truth. In my case, I'm talking about the state Utah specifically. I've been living here for the last 3 months, and I have noticed.
Why would a compliment need defending? To understand that, you have to go back further than the trip itself, back to what these travelers were handed before they ever set foot on a plane. For most Europeans under 50, an opinion about America was formed the same way a native language is formed, absorbed, not chosen. Decades of nightly news built a single coherent portrait, a superpower in decline, fractured by politics, armed to the teeth, exhausted by its own contradictions. It wasn't one outlet pushing this. It was the accumulated weight of thousands of segments, each one reasonable on its own, each one selected because conflict travels further than calm. A shooting leads the broadcast. A stranger holding a door does not. Over time, that selective diet stopped feeling like a curated narrative and started feeling like a fact of nature. The way America is dangerous became less an opinion and more a piece of common sense, the kind you don't examine because everyone around you already agrees with it. This is how a media environment builds consensus without ever having to argue for it. Repetition does the work that evidence usually has to do. So when someone announced they were heading to the US, the send-off wasn't really a wish for a good trip. It was a quiet transfer of expectations, pack a first aid mentality, watch your surroundings, don't be surprised by what you find. The travelers in this story absorbed that briefing, whether they wanted to or not. It became the lens they carried through customs. And that's precisely what makes admiration so disruptive when it shows up. It isn't just a differing opinion. It's a direct contradiction of something an entire social circle has treated as settled fact for years. To come home and say, actually it was safe, it was kind, it was better than I expected, isn't just describing a country. It's quietly accusing everyone back home of having believed something that wasn't true. That's a much harder thing to forgive than being wrong about a fact. It's being told your worldview needed updating, and nobody enjoys that. Especially not from someone who just got back from a 2-week holiday. So before a single travel video was filmed, the terms had already been set. Any story that confirmed the decline narrative would be welcomed home as validation. Any story that didn't would be met not with debate, but with something closer to suspicion, as if the traveler, not the narrative, must be the one who'd gotten something wrong. If danger is the story you're braced for, what do you do with kindness that asks for nothing back? That question rarely gets asked before the trip because nobody packs a defense against warmth. These travelers had rehearsed vigilance, how to read a room, how to keep their guard up, how to spot trouble before it found them. What they hadn't rehearsed was what to do when a stranger struck up a conversation with no transaction attached, no favor implied, nothing to gain by being kind. It showed up first in the smallest exchanges. A shopkeeper who spent a long, unhurried stretch of time explaining something to a visitor who was never going to buy anything. A passerby who asked how your day was going and then actually waited for the answer. None of it fit the file marked dangerous country, but it didn't fit friendly country either, at least not the version many had been carrying in. The assumption was that American friendliness would be surface level, a service industry reflex, warmth performed rather than felt. What eroded that assumption wasn't one grand gesture. It was the sheer repetition of small, unremarkable ones. The same unhurried patience showing up at a diner counter, a gas station, a random sidewalk conversation, again and again, with no pattern of self-interest behind any of it. A single act of kindness can be dismissed as a fluke. A dozen of them, spread across strangers who had nothing to gain, start to look like something closer to culture than coincidence. And that's the part that quietly worked against the original narrative. A country described as fractured, guarded, and suspicious of outsiders doesn't produce this volume of unprompted goodwill toward people who are, by every definition, outsiders. The travelers hadn't arrived looking for evidence of community. They'd arrived looking for confirmation of danger. But community was what kept interrupting the search. One small, inconvenient interaction at a time. By the time any of them tried to describe this back home, they ran into a problem. Kindness doesn't translate well into a headline, and it translates even worse into a warning. There's no viral clip format for "a stranger was patient with me for no reason." So the evidence kept piling up in a category nobody back home had built room for, which meant when they finally spoke about it, it landed as something closer to a confession than a travel story. Picture a car left running outside a grocery store, keys still in the ignition, doors unlocked, the owner already halfway through the produce aisle. In most of the world, that's not an anecdote, it's a countdown. Here, it was just Tuesday. This is the moment where the story stops being about people and starts being about objects. Because objects don't perform. A stranger can be polite for show. A parked truck left untouched overnight cannot. That's what made this particular category of evidence so hard to argue with. Nobody was being nice to the travelers. The proof was sitting there whether anyone was watching or not. It showed up in small, repeated tableaus. A truck idling outside a store with no one guarding it. A cooler of drinks left unlocked outside a shop, running on the same honor system all night. Public benches without a scratch on them. Parks without a stray piece of litter. The kind of upkeep that usually only survives in places actively being watched. Except no one was watching. It just held. Back home, this same scene would have triggered an entirely different instinct. Leave a car unlocked in a busy European city center, and the math is simple. It's not a question of if something disappears, it's a question of how many seconds it takes. That instinct wasn't paranoia, it was just an accurate read of a different environment, which is exactly why encountering the opposite felt less like relief and more like disorientation. The travelers weren't relaxing into safety, they were recalibrating an entire internal alarm system that had no reason to go off. And this is where the footage itself becomes the argument. A camera pointed at an empty street at midnight isn't dramatic. Nothing happens in it. That's the point. The emptiness is the evidence. The same way a locked door proves nothing, and an unlocked one proves everything. These travelers weren't filming events. They were filming the absence of an event that their entire upbringing had told them was inevitable. Multiply that scene by a dozen neighborhoods, a dozen unlocked doors, a dozen untouched trucks, and a pattern starts to look less like luck and more like infrastructure. The kind that isn't built by fences or cameras, but by a baseline level of trust between neighbors that either exists or doesn't. It's not that danger was absent from the entire country. It's that in the specific pockets these travelers walked through, the danger they'd been told to expect simply never clocked in for its shift. Scale is the kind of detail nobody mentions in a warning, because scale doesn't sound dangerous or safe. It just sounds like architecture. But for these travelers, the sheer size of everything around them turned out to be doing quiet work on their sense of safety, long before they consciously noticed it. A neighborhood street wide enough to be a 4-lane road back home. Front yards with no fencing, no barred windows, no visible defense system separating a house from the sidewalk. Children moving freely between yards without a wall in sight. None of this was engineered to prove a point. It was just how the space had been built, and that, in itself, told a story none of the headlines had prepared them for. Because open space is a kind of quiet confession. A place designed around high walls, gated entries, and barred windows is a place that has already priced in the expectation of trouble. A place that leaves its front yards open, its porches facing the street, its houses unguarded by anything more than distance, is a place that has made a different bet. That nothing out there requires that level of defense. You can't fake that kind of architecture for a camera. It gets built over decades based on what a community has actually needed to protect itself from, not what it fears it might need. This is what made the physical layout of these neighborhoods feel like evidence rather than aesthetics. The travelers weren't just observing wide roads and open yards as a design choice. They were unconsciously reading them as a trust signal, the same way anyone reads a locked gate as a warning. And the signal they kept receiving didn't match the caution they'd packed for the trip. It also explains something that had puzzled a few of them without their realizing it. Why the same warnings that felt so vivid on a screen back home felt so distant standing on an actual porch, in an actual open yard, at an actual dusk. Fear travels well through a headline. It travels far less convincingly through an open front lawn with no fence in sight. Space, it turns out, is one of the few things that argues back against a narrative, quietly, structurally, without ever needing to raise its voice. Of all the places on this itinerary, one name kept surfacing before the trip even started, not as a recommendation, but as a warning. Skip it. Don't wander at night. If you must go, stay alert. San Francisco had, in the retelling, become shorthand for everything the decline narrative wanted to prove. That reputation didn't come from nowhere. It came from a steady stream of segments built around the worst blocks, the sharpest problems, the most dramatic footage a city that size can produce. Because a city of that size, like any major metropolis, has genuine hard edges somewhere within it. The issue was never that those problems didn't exist. It's that they had been allowed to stand in for the entire city the same way a handful of frames can be cropped to represent a much larger, much calmer picture. So the travelers arrived braced for a stage set, one they'd been told to expect wall to wall. What they found instead, walking for hours through tree-lined streets and past pastel Victorian houses, climbing up the hillsides, was something closer to the opposite. Quiet, maintained, unremarkable in the way safe places usually are. Parked vehicles left for hours untouched. Streets without the visible decay the warnings had promised. A skyline and a bay view that had nothing to do with the footage they'd been shown before boarding the plane. This is the part worth sitting with, because it isn't a story about a city being secretly perfect. It's a story about how a single narrow slice of a place can be mistaken for the whole of it. San Francisco does have difficult pockets, the same way most major cities do. What these travelers stumbled onto was simply the rest of the map, the part that never made it into the segment, because empty tree-lined streets don't generate the same reaction as chaos does. That's the quiet trap in how any large, complicated place gets summarized for an audience that will never set foot in it. The loudest fragment becomes the whole story, not because it's representative, but because it's the only part interesting enough to broadcast. San Francisco wasn't the exception to the decline narrative. It was the first place where the gap between the highlight reel and the full picture became impossible to unsee. By this point in the trip, a pattern had formed that none of these travelers had gone looking for. Almost everything they'd been warned about kept failing to show up. And almost everything that did show up had never been mentioned at all. That gap doesn't happen by accident. It happens by design. Just not the kind of design anyone sets out to build on purpose. News, in its current form, isn't selected by importance. It's selected by what keeps a person watching, scrolling, clicking to the next segment. And nothing keeps attention like conflict. A car left unlocked overnight generates zero engagement. A shooting, a protest, a controversy, those numbers move. Over years, that single incentive, repeated across thousands of editorial decisions and algorithmic feeds, doesn't just shape what gets covered, it reshapes what an entire country is in the minds of people who will only ever see it through a screen. This is where individual choices stop mattering as much as the system they operate inside. No single editor sat down and decided to erase everyday American life from the narrative. But when calm doesn't perform and chaos does, the incentive stacks the same way every time, story after story, until the accumulated picture looks nothing like the place these travelers actually walked through. It's not a conspiracy, it's just what happens when attention is the currency and negativity is what earns it fastest. That's also why real experience hit so much harder than any single video could. A headline can tell you a place is dangerous. It can't make you feel the specific, disorienting calm of an empty street at midnight where nothing happens. Algorithms are built to amplify the exceptional, and safety is, statistically, the least exceptional thing a place can offer, which means the safest, most ordinary version of a country is almost guaranteed to be the version that never gets shown. So the disconnect these travelers kept running into wasn't a failure of honesty on anyone's part. It was a structural blind spot built into how information about the world gets selected, packaged, and delivered. One where the most common experience in a country is often the least visible one, simply because it never had a reason to go viral in the first place. Everything gathered so far could tip into its own kind of distortion if left here, because safe was never going to be the honest word for an entire country any more than dangerous was. The travelers who walked through quiet suburbs and untouched parking lots weren't wrong about what they saw. They just hadn't seen all of it. Safety, it turns out, isn't a national trait. It's a local one. The same country that produced empty midnight streets and unlocked trucks also contains neighborhoods just miles away, in some cases, where none of those things would hold true, where the original warnings these travelers carried in would have been entirely justified. A nation of that size doesn't have one texture. It has thousands, stitched together by local economics, history, and circumstance that no single trip, however eye-opening, could fully map. This is the detail that keeps the story honest rather than triumphant. The travelers hadn't discovered that the warnings were fiction. They'd discovered that the warnings were incomplete, built from a real category of place and quietly stretched to cover the whole country the same way their footage of calm streets left unchecked could just as easily be stretched to cover ground it was never meant to. Both versions, the fearful one and the glowing one, commit the same error. They just point it in opposite directions. What actually held up under scrutiny wasn't a verdict on America as a whole. It was something smaller and more useful. Proof that a place this size resists any single sentence written about it, and that the honest answer to "is it safe?" was never going to be yes or no, only where and why there specifically. None of what these travelers found was magic, and that might be the most important detail in the entire story. The empty streets, the unlocked trucks, the strangers who asked for nothing back. None of it happened because a place had been blessed with some quality other countries lack. It happened because of something far less cinematic. Decades of local trust, quietly built and quietly maintained, neighbor by neighbor, in the specific pockets where these travelers happened to walk. That's a harder story to sell than either version on offer back home. It's not as satisfying as Decline, and it's not as flattering as Triumph. It's just infrastructure. Social infrastructure, built the same patient way roads and power grids are, invisible until you notice its absence somewhere else. Which leaves the question this entire journey keeps circling back to, the one no headline and no highlight reel can answer for you. If a night spent walking one quiet street was enough to unsettle a lifetime of secondhand certainty, what else have we agreed to believe, simply because no one ever told us to go check for ourselves?